A new Directorate of Mechanization and Motorization was created under the command of Innocenty Kalepski. Kalepski was a technical guy by trade, and he spent his time in the Civil War in the early 1920s in various communications-related positions before being appointed Chief of the Military Technical Directorate in 1924. He may not have been a tactician, but he will have known how to run with engineers and factories, and it was obvious that the Soviet factories were not nearly capable of meeting even the production run of T-18s, let alone anything better. That something better would have to come from abroad, and a shopping list was created. From the Germans, the Vollmer KH-60 wheel-cum track. The British, the Cardinal Lloyd Mark VI and the Vickers Type E. From France, the NC-27, the Americans, a Christie convertible and the T-1E1. In the meantime, work on local tank designs was continued. The T-24 medium tank for punching in fortified lines was ordered in September 1929, with 25 being built in 1930. The 18-ton beast came with all of 22mm of armour, another 45mm gun, and 4 machine guns for the 3 crew. It would go at a fair clip of 24 kilometers an hour before it then broke down, but it would do. Also ordered in September 1929, the T-19 light tank for infantry support, which would prove to be kind of suspiciously like an NC-27's running gear on a sloped armour hull with a T-18 turret. The wheels were now in motion. Tukhachevsky started to let his imagination get a little ahead of things. With the Soviet production system starting to spin up, he started thinking in terms of an army which had tens of thousands of tanks, with battles which could be almost 200 kilometers deep, that distance being achieved by airborne troops to include air-dropped tanks. Chemical weapons would be used as a matter of course. The proposal reached Stalin. Science fiction was the pronouncement. At this point, Kalepski went on his shopping trip abroad to buy some tanks which had been identified as possibilities earlier. For some reason, a number of companies seemed to be suspicious of selling only 1 or 2 tanks complete with blueprints, so they had to buy in bulk. 20 Cardinal Lloyd Mark VI's, 15 Vickers tanks of 6 tons, the famous E's, and 15 12 tons, the so-called Vickers medium, were acquired from the UK. The purchasing delegation then went to the United States to look at the T-1E1 tank. When Christie then showed off his light tank, the Soviets stopped looking at Ordnance's design and just bought 2 of Christie's tanks for $60,000. They also bought the rights to license build the tanks for an additional $100,000. In hindsight, they seem to have gotten quite a good deal. The Cardinal Lloyds formed the basis of the T-27 tankette. Over 3,300 will be built between 1931 and 1934. The Vickers E that became T-26, initially built with twin machine gun turrets, it in effect competed for the infantry support tank position with the T-19. However, T-19 cost 96,000 rubles compared to 42,000 for the Vickers, and the Vickers was superior in almost every respect. T-19 went away. Oddly, the designers for T-19 were not shot. Over time, 1,627 twin-turreted T-26s will be built, about 450 of which were armed with a 37mm cannon in one of the turrets. The Vickers mediums were basically shelved, and of course the Christie was developed into the BT series, production starting in 1932 with either a 37mm gun or 1 or 2 machine guns, some 620 BT-2s being built. This now generally solved the matter of what tanks to build and how to build them. There was one exception: a breakthrough tank still had to be built. That task was given to the design team of the Bolshevik tank plant in 1931. Now all that remained was the question of how to use them. The experimental brigade was stood up in summer 1930 and generally followed the British example. Like most of the early experimental mechanized units, it was a bit tank heavy, but actually not too badly so, with 2 tank battalions, 1 infantry battalion and an artillery battery, and also some chemical and air defense units. Testing was not glorious. For example, the unit was tasked with cutting off a cavalry unit from the flank. The horses were faster and the tanks then ran out of fuel. That said, remember that we're still talking primarily about T-18 tanks here. The foreign designs, which were hugely more capable, were not yet in service. In the meantime, tank regiments were created of 3 battalions of pure tanks. They would be reserves that the infantry units could call upon to help their operations. The experimental brigade was expanded to 2 55 tank battalions, a reconnaissance regiment of 100 tankettes, 2 SP artillery batteries, a battalion of motorized infantry, and some anti-aircraft units. The tankettes, mainly T-27s to start with, soon became a major component of both recon and cavalry units. Not that Boudinot was happy about it. He joined in with other hippophiles in Germany and the USA in thinking that armoured vehicles might be able to assist the horse, but could never replace it. He proposed a cavalry division of 4 horse regiments, 1 artillery regiment, and 1 mechanized regiment. Whether other generals agreed with him or not, they shut up. He had powerful friends. In 1930, the now famous term deep battle was coined by Tukhachevsky in a memorandum to hire. The thinking was that the old ideas of attacking the front until it collapsed, or finding a flank which wasn't always going to be left conveniently open by the enemy, were probably not things to rely upon. Instead, front and rear would be assaulted at the same time. The rear would be attacked in 2 manners. Firstly, by airborne troops, and indeed a parachute kit was accepted for service to drop T-27s from TB-1 aircraft. This wasn't a massive drop mine. When Tukhachevsky created his first experimental airborne company in 1931, it was a 164-man unit but only had 2 T-27s for support. The other manner was of fast tanks, which would not stop the fight in the front line, known as DD tanks. Presumably, casualties were expected. The question of how to have the infantry keep up with the tanks for their fight in the enemy rear area was solved by simply putting the infantry on the tanks. Presumably more casualties were expected. I can only imagine the terror that an infantryman would feel holding on for dear life to a BT-2 as it careened through the enemy lines with machine guns and anti-tank guns shooting at it. Cheers. The front itself would then be attacked by 2 more waves of tanks. One, the DPP, designed to destroy individual points of resistance like enemy tanks and machine guns, and the third wave, the NPP, would be the one supporting the main infantry assault. All this time, the Red Army's god of war, artillery, would be hammering on the opposition, which probably means one more thing for the poor bugger holding on to the BT-2 to worry about. Tukhachevsky also had no particular solution to the problem of coordination and synchronization, but one step at a time. If the deep battle idea had questions of coordination, then deep operations was even more problematic. The deep battle was still basically premised around the area around the front line, 10 to 20 kilometers behind the distance that the supporting units of the enemy were to be found, particularly the artillery. Deep operations required large independent units to go herring off scores of kilometers, if not into the triple digits, resulting in their own unique sets of both logistical and communications problems. 1931 ended with 2 additional important marks. The first was the decision to create an amphibious light tank for reconnaissance purposes. In effect, a tankette with a turret. 2 design bureaus were put on the case. One decided to use as a basis the Carden 3-ton payload tractor, of which 3 had been purchased in 1930. This became T-33 and then T-37. The other turned into T-41. Both used cork on the sides to aid in flotation. In the end, an amalgamation was made. You take the T-37's hull, the T-41 superstructure, put them together, and you end up with the T-37A. Somewhere over 2,500 vehicles, including 650 with radios, were built 1933 to 36. The other important thing was an airplane crash. Not only was one of the People's aircraft destroyed, Triandafilov and Kalinovsky were killed, 2 of the more forward-thinking folks in the Red Army structure. How this would affect the future development remains to be seen. The USSR in 1931 was capable of producing a mere 700 tanks a year, compared to the tens of thousands that folks like Tukhachevsky wanted. It is worth considering, however, just how many countries had more than 700 tanks in the inventory of any sort at all. And it's actually a pretty short list. And the Soviets are going to start leapfrogging. The Germans seemed to be of little help. They were getting some technical information on tank construction from the joint operation at Kazan, but the Soviets were learning their own doctrine. Indeed, when Tukhachevsky visited the German maneuvers in 1932, he came back with the opinion that the Germans were being quite conservative and only going as far as partial motorization, not even partial mechanization. Of course, whether or not he saw everything is another matter. The Red Army set about creating its own armoured structure, and in early 1932 decided to create two mechanized corps. Each corps would have a mechanized brigade of 3 battalions of T-26s, a rifle machine gun battalion, an artillery battery, engineers, and air defence. Another brigade using BTs instead of T-26s, an infantry brigade, and various corps elements, including aircraft. Now go back over my other videos on France, Germany, UK and Italy and see if any of them dove into all-arms mechanization to the same extent. The Soviets are not mucking around here. British and Soviet opinion on tactical use was actually starting to match up quite a bit, except the Soviets are talking core, or more realistically by Western terms, big.
Basically, the Russians got 2 tanks at the beginning of the First World War, Second World War. And they got the T-26, and that's from the Vickers United Kingdom tank that they bought from those guys. And then they got the BT tank, which of course is from the Christie suspension that the guy went to America. They said they didn't want it, and then he went to the Russians and they say, I want it. And they took it, and then they made something out of it. Those are the 2 that they got at the beginning.
Divisions, when the British are still trying to sort out their brigades. An interesting observation may be that the Soviets didn't go quite as tank heavy as the other countries did in their tank infantry balance, and indeed the 2 mechanized corps were created from infantry divisions. However, it may be as much because of the political ideology indicating that the Red Army's strength was in the strength of its makeup of the people, as it was tactical considerations. Fuller's tank army was the expeditionary strike army of English imperialism. Deep battle was still being thought out, and enter a new chief of staff of the Red Army, Alexander Egorov. Really, he was just refining Tukhachevsky's earlier work, but importantly, he was enhancing it, not throwing it out. The idea of a deep penetrating armor force remained, the DD tanks. I can only presume that there was a thinking that anti-tank capabilities would be sufficiently weak that this deep penetration could not be stopped. The distances now though began to increase, with talk of 100-kilometer penetrations, and the idea of aircraft attacking 400 kilometers in taking hold. But this was despite reservations on just how effective aircraft actually could be on their own. If nothing else, they will cause disruption. The practical issues of this theory of operations was picked up by the director of military training, a chap by the name of Sadiakin. As far as he was concerned, commanders have now been talking about deep battle at a theoretical level for some 2 years, but nobody had actually written down the realities of how it would be done. It's all very well to say, an infantryman will be transported deep into the enemy's rear by holding on for dear life to a tank which will speedily punch through the front lines without getting destroyed on the way. But if we go out to the field and we put Private Ivan onto a BT in a field exercise, what would it actually look like? He spent the next 2 years trying to actually nail down the details. One detail which got nailed down was that 30 to 60% of the tanks in the 3 waves would likely be destroyed, and that there might be situations where it would be futile to even try, and we should just go back to the older doctrines. Another detail was that the tanks intended to go maybe as far as 100 kilometers into the rear would run out of fuel at about 30 or 40 kilometers in. The reality being that the tanks, even if fueled up before the battle, would not be running at economical cruise speed for the duration, despite the fact that the sales brochure gave these tanks a 120 kilometer range. In 1933, Sedyakin released provisional instructions for organizing for deep battle, which was the result of this detailed analysis. And in typical Soviet style, the instructions were also very specifically detailed, a bit sort of Khomeini-esque. Follow the instructions and you'll be fine. Order number 100 of the Red Army staff made deep battle the official doctrine of the army, basically given Sedyakin's manual official sanction. And yes, the old pre-deep battle doctrine still held if the formula for success prescribed for deep battle in the manual could not be met. 1933 started with the Red Army having 5 mechanized brigades, 2 tank regiments, 12 mechanized regiments, 4 mechanized cavalry battalions, and 15 and 65 independent tank and tankette battalions for the rifle divisions. At least those were the flags. The actual equipment was still being delivered. As you can see, they're definitely going heavy into this mechanization business. Soviet-German relations began to sour a bit, especially after Herr Hitler came to power and the Soviets stopped sending their officers to attend a joint facility at Kazan. Since Stalin and Voroshilov were not particularly pleased with Germany overall, and with the results of the Kazan school in particular, other officers weren't allowed to be either. It was bad form to say that the Germans were doing anything well, but in fairness at this point, the Soviets legitimately seemed to be doing fine on their own anyway. Probably the most pro-German chap was still Tukhachevsky. Well, okay, not necessarily pro-German per se, but he still felt that the Reichswehr did things worth studying. The school at Kazan was closed in September 1933. The 10 German vehicles still present were shipped back to Germany as well. Not that the Soviets really needed them anymore. May Day 1933, a new tank was unveiled to the public. 4 of these 22-ton monsters were paraded on Red Square and 2 in the Leningrad parade. These were the T-28s. Difficult to see behind the plating, but the suspension system on the T-28 is basically nicked from the Krupp Großtraktor with 2 triple pair bogies per side. The T-28 is generally overlooked today. It had the archaic land battleship multi-turret thing going, and the armour was unfortunately weak, but there weren't very many tanks out there which had a 3-man electric traverse turret with a full turret basket and a 45mm gun with both telescopic and periscopic sights. When the tank entered production, the gun now had a 76mm. Even the auxiliary machine gun turrets wasn't an obvious deficiency. Look what the British did with the A9 cruiser built years later. And though it also has the powered 3-man turret, A9 did not have a high explosive capable gun to go with its 2 machine gun turrets up front. Basically, Soviet industry had created what had a very good claim to be the world's most advanced and capable tank. They had problems by 1940, but by 1933 standards, T-35 of course would also be produced in 1933, but only 60 were built and the tank was far less successful for a number of reasons. It is also absolutely massive, and I had the pleasure of seeing one in Kubinka, and the thing is a monstrosity. Whatever its technological features, it was ridiculously oversized and under-armoured. So, apparently the Soviets were kind of hit and miss on this success rate. One of the more hits was the installation of the 45mm gun into T-26 and BT. Well, sort of. The gun was never fully semi-automatic. Yes, it is a thing. It has been described as quarter automatic. The breech would have to be manually opened, but automatically it closed as soon as you threw the new round in, unlike a normal semi-auto. What it was a matter of the recoil force of the type of round being fired. AP rounds resulted in the semi-auto function that one would normally expect from a semi-auto cannon today. At about the same time, the BT-2 was replaced on the production line by the BT-5. over 1,800 of them being produced in under 2 years. The T-28s would eventually find themselves assigned to 4 heavy tank regiments, along with the T-35s in one of them, designated to be specialty units to be used where they best fit in support of divisions and corps attempting a breakthrough, in a manner similar to the armoured divisions that the French would come up with some 6 years later for their Char B-1s. The Soviets haven't stopped yet. As the famous phrase goes, but wait, there's more. The Red Army is now on 5,500 tanks in 1933 and the taps are still open. By late 1933, exercises were showing that deep battle was proving easier said than done. There was some thought given to the concept of how to get the deep penetrating tanks past the front line, but not much changed. There was a proposal to make APCs out of T-26 chassis that also never went anywhere. There was even a proposal to combine armour and air under one command, since it seemed that the two branches would have to function closely together. And there were fundamental training gaps. Crews had no idea what they were doing and nobody seemed to know how to work together. A research group in the Frunze Academy in the meantime was attacking the question of deep operations. At the operational level, the leaning was towards 2 echelons, one focusing on the front line, the deep battle echelon in effect, and the second echelon being exploitation force going through the supposedly 40-kilometer gap in the front line as far as 200 kilometers deep before spreading out. Given that communications were liable to be a bit tricky, extremely detailed instructions were now required to be given by Central Command. That way there would be less chance of some subordinate commander herring off and doing something at the wrong time and letting the whole thing topple. There was one minor detail though. For the purposes of the experiment, the group came up with a plan to invade Poland. It made sense. I mean, they're on the border and they were the most recent likely enemy, barring the China skirmish. They then assessed the plan by doing a sanity check and concluded that the Red Army didn't have a hope in hell of achieving it. Capabilities for logistics, command and control, and the general state of the army overall were quite simply not up to snuff. If the army were not capable of conducting operations according to doctrine, maybe the doctrine, fantastic though it may be in theory, needs to be discarded in favor of something more practicable. 1934 was spent trying to tackle these problems, and the Red Army was going nowhere with it. The crews still were not well enough trained in simple acts of driving from A to B without having an accident, let alone trying to properly synchronize multiple echelons of tanks in a complicated attack. There was a serious push to drop the middle tank wave and just have the deep penetrating tanks, maybe with the APCs, and the infantry support wave. The defense suppression wave arguably could be dispensed with. The matter of getting troops to keep up with the tanks was still not settled either. One proposal went as far as to drop the rifle brigade from a mechanized corps and replace it with an airborne brigade. The short-term solution was to make the corps a little bit less unwieldy by dropping companies from 4 platoons to 3 and then dropping platoon size from 5 tanks to 3. Which also had the advantage of allowing equipment to be distributed more rapidly to more units, which now included a few shock divisions, which somebody had decided to create. These were mechanized infantry formations focused on the breakthrough. They were kind of heavy on equipment and relatively light on sustainment. The T-26s were taken out of the mechanized corps and replaced by BTs. The corps themselves were also reworked to be tank heavy. 3 battalions of tanks and 1 of infantry to a mech brigade, 2 or 3 mech brigades, and a rifle brigade to a corps. This resulted in the main power of the army again reverting to infantry units, as mechanized units didn't have much infantry. On the technology side of the house, BT-7 production started to come online, with better running gear, and notably the tank is now welded. Arc welding also started to be applied to the T-26s coming out of the factory, making the tanks lighter and safer. Relatively speaking, of course, we're still not talking heavy armor here. By 1935, there was still a lack of common understanding as to how to apply the deep battle principles in practice, and still some debate over just how much independence of action there should be allowed to the tank units. Ultimately though, the thinking was still that the infantry were the main effort, The operations of the tanks, whatever they were doing, had to be done in order for the infantry to eliminate opposition, even if it meant intercepting the enemy's operational reserves tens of kilometers from where the friendly infantry were fighting. Things started going pear-shaped for deep battle in 1936. A massive exercise was conducted in Belarus involving 85,000 troops, 1,100 tanks and 450 aircraft. Coordination between tanks and other units was horrible. Tank units often performed poorly even within themselves. Commanders misused their mechanized brigades entirely. The deep penetration tanks were assumed that they would take horrible losses unless supported by substantial artillery. Voroshilov observed that if the solution to getting tanks through was heavy artillery fire, well, good artillery would likely work well for infantry attacks as well, in which case, why are we spending all this money on tanks? The purpose of the tank is to help infantry breach the enemy's defense. The infantry is the primary arm of the service. One may wonder why the Red Army's future breakthrough tank was named after him. Now, this may strike one as being a couple of steps backwards, but Voroshilov was the war commissar and Stalin's buddy. He did not mention deep battle again, and neither did the Army's training plan issued for the 1937 year. However, the Army's Corps Field Manual issued that year, PU 36, did mention it. Tukhachevsky had a hand in writing it. Deep battle combined with deep operations was absolutely the way to go, but there were some tank modifications. That second defense suppression wave, the DPP, well, that went away. Tanks were now either close support or long-range penetration. But the purpose of the tank in both cases was the same: help the infantry. Either the infantry doing the attack on the front line or the infantry which was acting in depth. Interestingly, the majority of the manual revolved not around breaching fortified lines, but instead much more on hasty attacks from the march. It seemed to be assuming a generally fluid battlefield. In the meantime, in the world of amphibious tanks, the T-37A was succeeded by the T-38, which is basically an enlarged T-37A with the turret on the opposite side. The tank had greater range, and subtle modifications to the running gear meant that the tracks were far less likely to fall off, which was a known problem with the T-37A. Just over 1,200 T-38s would be built between 1936 and 1937. 1936 also brings us to the Spanish Civil War. As with other nations, the Soviets took a look at this European conflict and, like the Germans, they fought in it. The dominant conclusion seems to have been that given that this was a modern European war, the general gist of it was going to be what a modern war was going to be like. It's not that they didn't take correct notice of certain caveats, such as the fact that enemy tanks were lacking in anti-armor weaponry. It was T-26 versus Panzer I for much of it, and there was a conclusion that a major war would face an enemy armed with properly armed tanks. The Soviets were not pleased by the quality of radio communications, logistics, or the lack of coordination with infantry. The T-26s seemed to perform well as close infantry support though, which was fine, since that was what they were designed for. However, anti-tank defenses had grown far tougher than expected. AT guns were difficult to find, difficult to destroy, and pretty good at killing tanks. Remember, we're talking about nothing bigger here than the 45mm, more likely 37 and 20, so we're not looking at a huge signature here. On the other hand, a competent army would also have better artillery support than that which the Republicans provided, which might also protect the tanks a bit better, so it could be a wash. Not that Tukhachevsky or Kalepsky were given any particular input into the reporting. In early 1937 they were rounded up and shot. Actually, lots of people were rounded up in this one of Stalin's purges. 75% of various military districts officers were purged, for example, as if the Red Army didn't have enough problems getting its units to work together. And it wasn't just the officers. The purges happened everywhere, to include the tank design and manufacturing industry. Tank production in 1937 plummeted. Obviously, Tukhachevsky, who was in league with the Germans, had contaminated ideas. They could have been put forward to ensure Soviet doom. Perhaps this is why the Red Army was having difficulty placing the doctrine into practice. Tukhachevsky had deliberately come up with a way of reducing the Red Army to ineffectiveness in order to aid the imperialists by sending them down this deep battle wild goose chase. Combine that with the information coming from Spain, including that unescorted tanks were dead meat to AT units without close infantry support, and well, this deep battle idea has some serious questions, and the focus obviously has to change. Also, tank platoons were brought back up to 5. 3s didn't seem to have enough firepower, at least according to the Spanish experience. As a result, training evolutions from 1938 were focused on combined arms operations. You will recall Egorov, Chief of Staff of the Army, refined and worked on Tukhachevsky's deep battle. Survival instincts seem to have kicked in. He now joined Budenyi in emphasizing the importance of the bayonet attack, given the amount of close combat occurring in Spain. Survival instincts were not enough, and he was later purged as well. Couldn't really have been foreseen. It was a second purge. In 1938, 80% of battalion commanders and chiefs of staff were removed. These were the guys who accompanied commanders in 1937. A third purge got rid of their replacements as well. Some lieutenants went from company XO to division commander within 3 years. It was also obvious that nobody was about to rock the doctrine boat. Shut the hell up, do nothing to attract attention to yourself, and go with whatever Voroshilov and his friends say. Also, mechanized units were reflagged as tank units with a much higher tank to infantry ratio. A tank brigade now had all of a company of troops. In effect, they were to become like the tank regiments, i.e. a supporting tool in the kit box that an overall commander could have. In the meantime, to solve the tank production problem, it was decided to rationalize the fleet. The general purpose tank would be an improved T-26. The BT would be evolved. A new heavy tank would be required. This one with actual armor, given that it seemed that T-28 and T-35 armor would not suffice, given what was going on in Spain. And a new amphibious tank would replace T-37A and T-38. The T-27s by this point had generally been relegated to artillery tractor duty. The T-26 variant never got anywhere, as the T-25 just didn't work, and neither did the ST-35, which is a simplified version. The evolved BT was to be the A-20, but the designer decided to make a heavier variant, A-32, while he was at it. The heavy tank, well, 3 designs were developed for the role. The light amphibious tank would become T-40, the first Soviet vehicle with torsion bars. Unfortunately, they didn't think to add shocks, so the things just bounced and rocked ridiculously to the discomfort of the crew. Only 132 were built by the German invasion, of which 18 were combat ready. Just to add to the Soviet problems, a little incident was brewing in the Far East, specifically at Lake Kazan. After the Japanese crossed the border, the Soviets took their time, drew up overwhelming forces, and then attacked. This was now an attack against an entrenched enemy in pretty poor terrain, and Soviet losses were hideous. They technically won, but it was something of a Pyrrhic victory. Officially, the reason was that the Far Eastern District Commander, Blücher, not the same guy from Waterloo, was at fault. He had not purged the ranks of enemies of the people, and had put people into positions who were unable to do their job. Which seems a bit counterintuitive. If he had purged them, they certainly wouldn't have been able to do their jobs. Blücher also did not survive the year, meeting his end in an NKVD cell in Moscow. Strange that. Starting to run out of apple juice. In the meantime, there was still the matter of what to do with all these tanks. The losses of so much armor against the Japanese indicated a problem. Voroshilov was of the opinion that the deep penetration tank idea was clearly discredited. At best, tanks would be used close to the front line to help the infantry, if not actually accompanying them. However, he refused to go as far as relegating tanks to self-propelled assault guns for the infantry. The state had spent a lot of money on these things, so somebody damn well better find a use for them. The next set of instructions on armor did authorize the use of DD units to destroy enemy reserves and artillery, but it also said that the infantry commander had veto authority on that. Leading this charge to reduce independent operations was the Chief of Armor Directorate, Pavlov. The textbooks of 1939 destroyed even that DD option. The deep penetration group wasn't mentioned at all, and the attacks on the enemy's rear were given only brief discussion. Infantry was placed front and center of all other arms which were to support them. In effect, the manuals had gone back to 1921. There was a little caveat given to tank groups under very specific conditions of terrain and lack of enemy defenses for a move to the enemy's deeper areas, but it had to be well supported by Air Force and artillery. That was it. Enter then, stage right, Zhukov and his actions at Khalkhin Gol. It's often considered that he used the discredited deep battle theory in his victory, although really it was more of a classic double envelopment. Punch through the weaker flanks and then move inwards to attack the enemy from all sides. In this, he combined the traditional use of tanks, artillery and aircraft to support infantry with the high-speed maneuver possibilities afforded by tanks and motorized artillery. That the Soviets didn't immediately think, oh, maybe deep battle was right after all, is not surprising, as the premise of deep battle or deep operations was more than simply being a war of maneuver. Reports from the after-action investigations indicated that the tanks without infantry were not as successful as tanks with infantry. One tank brigade, which haired off on its own, caused havoc for a while, but eventually had to return to its start point without any infantry to clear and hold. Another brigade made a tank-only attack against Japanese infantry who had barely arrived in position. The tanks won, but only after the Japanese had extracted a heavy toll of Soviet losses. Now, that said, they did work quite nicely as pillboxes in the defense, with some units moving to flank attacking Japanese as they charged at Soviet infantry, and others, well, they just sat with the infantry. So, no harm done. We can still disband the tank corps. They were intended for independent action and there's no point to them anymore. It happened that the war started before they could all be disbanded, and a tank corps did partake in the invasion of Poland. The operation did not go amazingly well. The Soviets lost some 350 of 1,700 tanks, which, considering they were attacking a Poland already well engaged at the front, is not really something to write home about. The tank's questionable success affirmed the decision to abandon the corps and to spread the tanks out amongst other units, to include assigning small numbers of tanks to quote-unquote mechanized rifle divisions. On the other hand, it was also concluded that the tanks needed to become more powerful than they already were. Enter the A-32 mentioned earlier, also stage right. A tank not specifically requested, but built because it could be. With more armor, a few detail changes and a new name, T-34, it would replace T-28 and T-26 to start with. They would not be ready for Finland, but just under 900 would be around for the German invasion. Unfortunately, just over 800 of them had never been driven outside of the factory acceptance trials and then to park them, in order to save on wear and tear. Only 46 vehicles were authorized for training purposes. As a result, T-34's introduction into battle would prove to be disappointing, with basically every single one of them being lost within a month and a half. Spoiler alert though, T-34 units do start sorting themselves out by the end of the year. Barely had the results of the Polish campaign been assessed that the Soviets decided to have a crack at the Finns. And as you may have seen, this did not end well for the Soviets. Tanks were either used in small numbers to support a massed infantry attack, or they were used in large numbers independently. The terrain conditions also, well, kind of sucked for tanks. After a bit of a ponder, the Red Army tried again. This time, tanks were applied in large numbers and in close support of the infantry. This worked. Again, though, something of a Pyrrhic victory. Some lessons were learned, of course. Firstly, there was a special platoon of heavy tanks created. The prototypes of SMK, T100 and KV were used together. The KV proved to be the best of the bunch, which was fortunate because 50 of them had already been ordered, and the tank would go on to cause the Germans much annoyance the following year. Secondly, small units of tanks were a silly idea. Independent companies and battalions generally needed to go away. The initial proposal from April 1940 combined them all into brigades of 4 battalions, thus concentration of armour would be assured. Thirdly, though working with infantry did seem to fare better, and indeed the tanks were often used to transport troops in the deep snow, there was the problem that the tanks and troops were simply not used to working together. By May 1940, the Commissariat for Defence had come up with a solution for these last 2 points: a tank division. Consisting of 2 tank regiments and 1 heavy tank battalion, 2 medium tank battalions and a flamethrower tank battalion, it would also have an artillery regiment and a motorized rifle regiment. The troops in this regiment, being part of the tank division, would be trained in how to work effectively with tanks. That wasn't the end of it though. Something else happened in May of 1940. The Germans, wiping the floor with the British and French, combined with all those propaganda newsreels of massed panzer units being the key to victory. There's a lesson in this, by the way. Come back next year for the American Doctrine video. The Germans were using corps of multiple panzer divisions together. Obviously, there was something to it, so those corps that had been disbanded were now coming back, albeit with a slightly different configuration. 8 of them, each with 2 armour and 1 motorized division. Of course, now that they were coming back, there was still the matter of just what to do with them. Obviously, some folks, such as Zukov, writing in December 1940, argued in favour of the German successes being a perfect example of deep continuous operations, and that a tank corps would be perfect for them. He also advocated for 3 waves of tanks, supported by artillery to destroy the front line, the last of which would help the infantry forward for the final blow with the bayonet. Sounds familiar. Others, perhaps closer than they would have known, argued that the German success may just have been a lucky break, that such deep successes cannot be considered reliable, especially in cases where there may be fortifications. Sure, if the opportunity comes up, please go ahead and maraud in the enemy's rear, but you can't go about creating a doctrine based on hope. In the end, the answer was never really sorted out by the time that the Germans launched Barbarossa, and the initial Soviet responses tended to result in the tanks being used purely in support of infantry, with the unfortunate results that we are, in hindsight, aware of. So, that's how the Soviets went from using tanks as infantry support to deep maneuver to infantry support to deep maneuver in the interwar period, all while investing heavily in the tank as a weapon, even if they were never quite sure what to do with them. Hope you found the above interesting and informative. Please go ahead and check out my other videos on the topic, and I will see you on the next one. Take care. Greetings all! This is, in effect, a reissue of an earlier video which is no longer available on this channel. It's a talk I gave at the New York Military Affairs Symposium back in 2017. If you want the longer version with the audience participation and whatnot, the original is linked to on the C-SPAN website below, but I'm putting the Redux here for 2 reasons. Firstly, nobody ever browses C-SPAN, and secondly, frankly, it helps my algorithm for it to be here. Fortunately, I still had the original slides to recreate it. So, onwards, for those who want a simple YouTube link. The talk was a bit of a sequel to the Myths of American Armor video. If you haven't seen it, link below also. Yes, I know, it gets off to a bad start where I misspeak about honey, the whole even if the British use it, they got it from the Americans, which turns out if you read Rob Crisp's book, that seems to be the indicator. But in general, the video as a whole still holds up. In any case, for this talk, I decided to go back a little bit to show why the US ended up with the vehicles it had in World War II, and more specifically, the AFVs. Whilst it's all very well talking specifics and performance, there's nothing wrong with occasionally going back and seeing what the fundamentals are. Now, I like to try to put audience participation questions in if I can when I'm doing a talk, but since there is no audience for this one, you need to think about these for yourself at home or in your car, or wherever it is that you're listening to this. So audience participation question number 1 was, what was a better common service rifle through World War II than the M1 Garand? Whilst one can maybe make a statement for the STG-44, for example, the M1 rifle was in full-scale production for the duration of America's war. It was standard issue equipment. The STG-44, the SVT-40, pick your semi-auto, they were uncommon. Having good equipment is only part of the problem. It has to be good enough whilst also still being fieldable. And so on, you can continue. Were there any better fighters overall than the Mustang, the gearing for a destroyer, an Essex class carrier, or a better artillery fuse than the VT? Okay, you can quibble the details, but if the US didn't have the best of something, it was very likely in the running as a damn good competitor. And in the non-combat arena, you're talking things like the Handy Talkie, the Deuce and a Half. Some say the Higgins boat won the war, some say the Jeep won the war. Victory or Liberty ships, fantastic at their job of getting lots of cargo from A to B, even if B is a Pacific island with no harbors. They were getting built in 4 weeks flat. The record was 4 days. So, whilst there were certainly some exceptions where a few other countries had their own area of particular specialty that they excelled at, but as a general rule, anything that the US went to war with was one of the best of its type in the world. So the question to be posed is, what happened? How did the US go from pretty much the best of everything to that? Well, I argue that actually the US did not get it wrong, and there were very specific decisions made in the US as to why the M4 ended up the way that it was and why we ran with it through to the very end and even into Korea. So the intent here is to get across the thought processes behind the tank, which then brought us to audience participation question number 2. I'll give you a moment to ponder your chicken or egg question. This is where you get the musical background. Well, the answer. In 2006, the University of Norwich concluded that it was the egg. However, the finding was later reversed by the universities of Sheffield and Warwick in 2010 in a paper entitled Structural Control of Crystal Nuclei by an Eggshell Protein. And so current scientific thought therefore indicates that the answer to the question of which came first, the chicken or the egg, is the chicken. So there is science answering the difficult questions, so you've probably at least learned something already. But why would I have posed such a question? What is the relevance to chicken or egg to the subject of US armored vehicle design? Well, the chicken and egg in this process, at least according to Nicholas Moran, are Army Ground Forces on the left-hand side, who are the guys who develop doctrine and equip the force, and on the right-hand side, Ordnance Branch, the guys who actually do the developing of equipment. Okay, I get it. AGF didn't actually exist as an organization for the very first part of the war, but they'll make a good placeholder for the folks who did the same job. So the chicken-egg question in this context is, should doctrine match the equipment which has been created by the engineers, or should technical development be geared towards meeting whatever doctrine requires? So, ask yourself, did doctrine drive technological design and development? Or does technology drive the doctrine? Well, to answer that question, we can look at a quote by Major General Gladian M. Barnes. And he is what I referred to as the mad scientist of the US Army in World War II. He comes up with all these wonderful designs and pieces of equipment, and he believes that he knows better than everybody else what the Army needs. Now, in fairness, the vast majority of times, the stuff which came out of Ordnance Branch's R&D division under him was pretty damn useful. But anyway, to quote him, "It is not well understood that tactics are usually written around a particular weapon. Thus, field operations ordinarily do not generate ideas leading to new materiel. A new piece of equipment must first be produced, such as, for example, a machine gun, before the tactics can be devised for the exploitation of the capabilities of the weapon. For these reasons, it is necessary for the Ordnance Department to take a strong lead over the using services in the development of new equipment, and then to get the help of those using services in determining where the weapon best fits into battlefield operations. So if you talk to Ordnance, the answer to the question is that technology drives doctrine. And in fairness, it is pretty hard to argue against the idea that you can't come up with a doctrine which uses and thus requires the development of a machine gun if you have no idea that you can make a machine gun in the first place. However, should you go to the archives and you look up the history of Army Ground Forces, and that's actually the name of the paper, you will see the following quote. The bottom line for this one is that Army Ground Forces would draw up the specifications, which would then be submitted to Ordnance, and Ordnance would then design the equipment to match what it was that Army Ground Forces wanted the equipment to do. So to be clear, you have the users, Army Ground Forces, saying that they are the lead body, and you have the engineers saying that they are the lead body. And both sides have reasonable arguments. The process today is this. And I'm happy to say I am not in procurement, and this one is a slide of how the Army does things. Now, if you can figure that out, more power to you. Now, if you want to go down a procurement rabbit hole, there is a link below to an interview I did with the two general officers in charge of setting requirements and procuring vehicles today at this time of recording, Major General Dean and Brigadier General Norman. And you can get all sorts of questions answered as to what today's process is. The short version is that today it is driven by the operational needs from the force, and the engineers work to suit. But this talk is about World War II. Operational needs statements, as we call them today, did exist in World War II. One I saw was akin to, we want a device that you can put onto a tank that if you're driving along in a tank at least 15 miles an hour, it will detect the mine so that you can stop before you hit a mine. Now, we haven't really gotten to that level of technology today, but these requests were coming to Ordnance from the field, and a lot of times Ordnance did indeed develop material which met the requirements of the field force. But anyway, it's a little bit beside the point. As I continue on with this presentation, just keep that tension in the back of your mind. That said, let's go back to before the US joined World War II, and you can see how Army Ground Forces felt the US Army was equipped. And as you can see, the standard of equipping was, put simply, terrible. In effect, the US was going to build its World War II force from scratch. To quote Army Ground Forces again, reduced to its simplest terms, the problem is to produce the kinds of equipment which will be needed most and could be manufactured in the required hundreds, thousands, or millions in time to be of use. Now, all of that is important, but I stress the in time to be of use. You've got a war to fight, and you can't hang around waiting for the perfect piece of equipment. Perfect, as the saying goes, is of course the enemy of good enough. In January 1940, in a lecture before the Army Industrial College, the then Chief of Ordnance, Major General C.M. Weston, estimated that the development of a major item of material required a minimum of 3 years from requirement to fielding. In the exigencies of war, they usually cut that down to 1.5 to 2 years, sometimes even as little as 1. But this timeline of 1.5 to 2 generally matches with any piece of equipment developed by anyone else, such as Britain, Soviet Union, or Germany. 1.5 to 2 years. So, to put the US position into perspective, have a think about what the two biggest problems the US faced were as it prepared to fight World War II. And again, I'll give you a moment to ponder this question. And the answers are Atlantic and Pacific. Anything the US built to fight was going to be fighting many thousands of miles, including an ocean, away from the nearest factory. Not only has it got to get there, it also has to be sustained. So this means you need to have as few parts break as possible in order to reduce the need for spare parts to be produced, reduce the shipping requirements to ship those spare parts, and then all the consumables like gasoline and oil, which also have to go across the ocean, not least to transport those spare parts on trucks to wherever it is that you're going. You get the idea. Note also that unlike the Germans, who, if they had to do a complete refurb on a tank, could simply ship the tank back to the factory, and actually so could the Soviets if they felt they had a need to, the US basically could not. Anything the US sent over was there to fight until it was either discarded or destroyed. Major repair in the US was not an option. Further, you have to think about the entire chain, from factory floor to battlefield. Now, here is an example of one of these problems people don't often think about. In 1948, there were 12,122 flat cars in the United States which could carry a Pershing tank. And the reason this came up is that in May of 1948, for an exercise, they wanted to get a battalion of Pershings from Fort Knox to Fort Campbell, the other end of Kentucky. It took 40 days to collect enough flat cars. Now again, that's 1948. So if you go back to, say, 1942, how many flat cars would have been capable of carrying a 45 to 50 ton tank and everything else in that weight class that has to get to a ship? And when you get to the port or the shipyards, you get the Liberty ships. What is the lifting capacity of a Liberty ship crane? If you make 60-ton monsters, can you actually pick the thing up and get it to a fight? Okay, you probably could, but could you get it in sufficient numbers to have an effect? Especially when you're talking about dropping off tanks on Pacific Islands where there is no infrastructure of any note. Indeed, the US Army ended up having to build cranes in some ports in Australia to handle loads, let alone the less well-developed islands. So, in short, what use is having the best equipment of the world if it cannot get to the fight, or if it is too broken to fight once it gets there? If it breaks down, well, then you've just wasted all that shipping and all that effort to get a tank overseas to see it break down and sit in the motor pool instead of fighting. So that's the basic overview. Let's get into the nuts and bolts. Again, to quote Army Ground Forces official history, AGF established two criteria for the development and approval of new equipment. The first was genuine battle need. It was reluctant to initiate development of any equipment not considered essential to increase combat efficiency. It tended to oppose development of new equipment which, though perhaps desired by men in the field, was not absolutely essential and might prove to simply be a luxury or excess baggage. This was a clear-cut policy of General McNair, one which he often emphasized. It was eventually adopted formally as War Department policy. So, who determined battle need? Who would determine what was essential equipment versus what was luxury equipment? One school of thought said that the theater commanders should be the determining agency. The other school of thought said that the decision should be centralized in the US. The reasoning behind the idea of centralizing the decision, as recorded, was that theater commanders might be too strongly influenced by the limiting local conditions of their own tactical situation to exercise proper overall judgment. They also believed that theater commander recommendations were sometimes colored by the combat soldiers' natural attachment to reliable equipment with which they were familiar. That's a quote. Basically, they were worried that the troops in the field, with equipment they knew, would be reluctant to take a leap into the unknown and request new equipment with which they would not be familiar. And there is some evidence to support this line of thinking. Witness 6th Armored Division in October of 44, which reported that they had received no 76mm tanks and had no particular desire for any. The 75 had gotten them all the way across France. Why rock the boat? What they had was obviously working. So many troops were refusing to move from the M10 to the M18 that Army Service Forces was about to cancel production on the basis that, quote, if the troops won't use them, it's useless to produce them, unquote. The War Department, and to a large extent McNair, however, went with the former view. They did not produce and ship material overseas unless the end users were asking for it. So, Even if the guys in DC thought something was a great tank and should be shipped overseas, they asked the commanders in Europe and North Africa. If they said no, the equipment did not go overseas. I should say also in the Pacific. The second criterion was reliable performance in combat. And again, I'm quoting here. This standard, sometimes known as battle worthiness, meant that the equipment, having proved capable of performing the function for which it was designed, was sufficiently rugged and reliable to withstand the rigors of combat service without imposing excessive problems of maintenance. Unquote. It's not an unrealistic goal. Note, they are trying to eliminate excessive problems, not all problems. The thing's going to break down. Total bulletproof reliability is unrealistic. There is perhaps a subcategory not mentioned in the history, which I might call immediate capability. Army Ground Forces was willing to accept suboptimal equipment in terms of capability if it was a case of that or nothing. It still needed to be reliable, though. Cases in point would be your tank destroyers, M3 or M10, which were interim vehicles pending purpose-built ones, i.e. the M18. So, if we look specifically at tanks, the US started the war with M2 mediums. The US had at the time what Harry Yeide has called the cult of the machine gun. The infantry branch at the time owned the tanks. Cavalry had combat cars, which were basically small tanks, but the big stuff was infantry. Infantry were quite interested in the tank's ability to deal with enemy infantry. So on this M2, you can see sponsored machine guns everywhere, deflectors on the back to ricochet rounds into a trench that you were paralleling. The 37mm up top was an anti-tank gun, and mounted on the M2 for its anti-tank capability. Somebody had very early on figured out, if we have a tank, they might bring a tank, and we have to be able to kill their tank. But the main weapon was the machine gun. And this tank was limited to about 15 tons by policy because that was the capability of the average road bridge in the US at the time. It should also be added that the Corps of Engineers had their own limitations on bridging equipment, which was pretty darn low at the time. In 1939, the US Army decided to be scientific about things and conducted a series of tests to determine if machine guns or the 75mm gun firing high explosive rounds would be more effective at killing infantry. Survey says 75mm. For the purposes of the test here, what they've done is they put a 75mm pack howitzer into the hull of an M2 medium. The vehicle, though, should start perhaps looking a bit familiar. And then this happened. Photograph taken near Sedan. The Germans very quickly overrun France, and the US takes away a couple of lessons. Firstly, the 37mm gun was not going to cut it in the anti-tank role. Something bigger was required. But fortunately, they had already tested the 75mm. The second problem, and this is where the talk kind of starts to split into two tracks, they create tank destroyers to deal with it. So I'm not only going to cover why the Sherman was designed the way it was, but also briefly I'll talk about the TDs again. The solution that was proposed was build M3s. You basically take an M2 medium, take an improved 75mm, place a new turret on top with the 37mm at the insistence of infantry branch. Ordnance were quite happy to have a turretless tank. Add a few more gadgets and gizmos and you now have an M3. Nothing significant on this tank is particularly new. It's basically an evolutionary improvement on things they know already work. And this is the sort of thinking which will dominate Army development and procurement for the next while. They build Detroit Tank Arsenal, but initially the Army only wanted 350 M3s. The problem was that the Soviets and British had such demand for American tanks that they couldn't stop producing M3s to allow time to switch over to the M4. In the end, they built about 6,500 M3s. Now, the US was not alone in this problem. Something similar happened in the UK with the 6-pounder. The 6-pounder was developed before the war, but after the fall of France, they're staring across the channel with their re-equipping army and awaiting the German invasion. They had a choice to either not field units with anti-tank guns at all, whilst they took the time to retool to the better 6-pounder, or to just continue building 2-pounders for the sake of having something out there in the field right now. Obviously, the British just went with what they had ready to go, which is why the 6 pounder took so long to get built. Similarly, look at the Soviets with the T-34 tank. The T-34 was supposed to be supplanted by the T-34M, complete with torsion bars, etc. However, the Germans invaded, and the US decided to not waste any time and just go with what they had. Now, there were gradual improvements found on the M3, such as stabilizers, new heavy-duty bogies for the larger M3A4 with the multi-bag engine. Some had cast hulls, so the Army was getting experience making cast hull tanks and so on. Now, the other question was, how do you stop the panzers? And we go back to this split I mentioned. There was no way to put enough anti-tank guns to stop a concentrated armored attack. The solution was to have mobile, rapid anti-tank guns that could meet the enemy attack at the point of penetration, and these would beat up all the tanks, hence the development of the tank destroyer branch. I have discussed this a few times in the past, I believe. A purely defensive doctrine which, according to the principles of the thing, was not supposed to be used in the attack. So, TDs defend against enemy attacks. American tanks are capable of shooting at enemy tanks. It's been that way since before 1939 with the M2 medium, and all this rubbish about American tanks weren't supposed to destroy tanks is rubbish. Again, look at the other videos I have linked below. Most of you have seen this already, but I mention this for people who haven't seen any of the other videos. The other problem that the US had was that it didn't have a heck of a lot of anti-tank equipment. Can you throw rifles and BARs into a tank track to stop it? On the right, one of my favorite photos I've ever found in the archives. A declassified photograph of an anti-tank rock, which failed to stop the tank, and you can see where the track sheared the rock. You've also had things like Molotov cocktails, the caliber 50, and then later the 37mm. The US's anti-tank capability was a little bit lacking until the 37 entered production in 1939. Then there was the question of whether they wanted these mobile tank destroyers to be towed guns or really fast. Yeah, I know the picture is a Cromwell, just go with it. The thinking of the towed guns was that these would be very hard to spot. The master of the tank. McNair used a comparison of coastal artillery versus battleships, and the fact that guns were a lot cheaper than tanks. I'm going to come back to this, but money was a problem for army procurement. Buy war bonds. We need money to fight, and so on. Yeah, America solves many problems by throwing money at them, but they still need to get the money in the first place. So, if you can make a really cheap tank destroyer, that's better for the army than an expensive tank destroyer. However, in the end, Bruce, the head of tank destroyer branch, won out. All of the tank destroyers would be mobile and self-propelled, and thus more expensive than towed guns. It's worth noting that whilst McNair gets a lot of flack for his opinions, he wasn't always the one making the final decisions, and he often let his subordinates in those relevant sections, i.e. the subject matter experts, shall we say, make the decisions, and then he would back them. That's it. For the record, in 1941, the Chief of Infantry stated that the best weapon to kill a tank was another tank. A lot of debate about this, including, I should say, on the German side. So here are a couple of examples of designs just for the light platoons of the tank destroyer companies that we're going to set up. The light platoon was to be equipped with a 37mm. The heavy platoons had the 75.5 track. So there's T2, T14, T8, and T2E1, all designed to get a 37mm into the fight. There are even more 37mm gun motor carriages designed, T23, T22, T21, and an M3. A lot of designs were tried out to fit the doctrinal requirement of, we must have a self-propelled 37mm anti-tank gun. And this is an example of the doctrine driving technical development. On the other hand, one of those TDs ended up being used in a new doctrinal role as the M8 Greyhound. The final winner for all this was T21, type classified as the M4. Fargo 3/4 ton truck with a 37mm on the back, and it was selected for production, not because it was the best, but because it was the first to meet all the requirements. The T8 and T14 actually turned out to be better vehicles in testing, But if you needed something in the field sooner in order to fight the enemy, the M4 was it. It was then noticed that, yeah, we just called it the M4, but we also just invented an M4 tank, and this could start getting confusing. So they renamed the gun motor carriage as the M6, apparently later forgetting this leap of logic when the M6 heavy tank is named. The M6 GMC enters mass production, gets shipped off to Africa, where they are utterly useless and then immediately withdrawn from service. But the reason I'm telling you this is to show the swarms of development going on to meet one single tactical requirement, which all cost money. Meanwhile, that other M6 is showing up. 60 ton, 3.5 inches of armor and a 3-inch gun, which at the time was considered to be the biggest gun anyone in the world was trying to put into a tank. It turned out that no, the Germans were working on the 8.8, but they didn't know that at the time. Add a 37mm coaxial and a 1000 horsepower radial engine. They tried 2 transmission types, hydraulic and electric, and so on, but it did use a horizontal volute suspension system. It's hidden behind the armor plating, but it is HVSS. I will refer you now back to the earlier issue of flat cars and ship cranes, even discarding the problem that in testing the tank didn't really work anyway. Devers, the head of Armoured Force at the time, looked at the vehicle and said, quote, "Due to its tremendous weight and limited tactical use, there is no requirement in Armoured Force for a heavy tank. The increase in the power of armament of the heavy tank does not compensate for the heavier armor. Also, they would prefer to ship 2 30-ton tanks instead of one 60-ton tank." And that was assuming they could actually fix all the problems that it actually had. So, the M4 it is. Note they still had all the machine guns at the front. They still hadn't quite gotten away from that idea. And indeed, if you look at the front of every M3 medium, you'll see the holes for the fixed forward-firing twin MGs. They are completely useless, but the Americans kept them anyway for a bit. And they show up in T-54s. Anyway. This tank is all about reliability and sustainability. Everything on this tank pretty much has been done before. The engine was used and known to work from the M3. The suspension system was known to work from the M3. The 75mm gun, known to work for the M3. There were a few improvements, such as a new gearbox, a new stabilizer system, and so on, but generally the tank is evolutionary. Also note how easy it is to maintain. Note the bolts holding the front armor in place. You simply undo the bolts at the front of the tank. The front comes off with your firing drives and transmissions. It's very easy to maintain. Suspension. Well, if you have a problem with your suspension system, there are 16 bolts. Undo the 16 bolts, swap out the suspension unit, you're done. Try doing that with a T-34 or a Panther or whatever. No one here is easy. The other thing is that everything fits from the front. The head of the British tank mission, G. MacLeod Ross, made mention in his book, The Business of Tanks, that you would never see a vice on an engineer's workbench in a US factory. It was a sign of incompetence. The only reason to have a vice on your bench was to hold a piece while you did something to it, probably to make it fit. If you did your job right in the first place, you wouldn't need a vice to make your part fit. Everything made in a US factory was to tolerance specification and was completely interchangeable. Unlike other countries like Germany or the UK, where you had artisans making these things and vices were a sign that you knew what you were doing. So go off to YouTube. You will find a video by John Parshall. Yep, that Navy guy. I'll put a link to it below. He got roped into a tank talk. It's called Kursk, the Epic Armored Engagement. He's the second speaker in the video. He talked about construction techniques in a German tank factory in World War II. Now, it was a case of, they'd try a piece. If it didn't fit, they'd lop a bit off or they'd weld something on, whatever. It's an interesting talk. It also compares, if I recall, with the Soviets. Back to the tank. It's reasonably well armored. It has a good front slope. And if you take into account the thickness of the armor with the slope, it's almost as thickly armored from the front as a Tiger is. It's a pretty tough tank for the time, and 75mm was capable of killing anything on the battlefield at the time. It's easy to drive. It's ergonomically sound. However, like everything, it can be improved. And the tanks which left the factory in 1945 are entirely different to the tanks which left the factory in 1942. Maybe the headlight lamps were the same, or perhaps the fuel filler caps, but basically the Sherman had totally changed. Almost no pieces are identical. They sent the tank out to the field. Reports started coming back. And initially the reports are glowing. So a couple of quotes from the British. The tanks M4 have made a great impression on everyone, and the troops are thrilled with them. The long gun is magnificent, both in accuracy and penetration, and the sights are a considerable improvement on the ground. Users are giving unstinted praise to all American equipment, particularly the M4, which embodies all desired improvements, except ideal gun sights. Would stress again, it is vital we receive earliest large numbers of M4, regardless of the availability of tools and spares for which we are prepared to wait. So the tank was doing well, but there was room for improvement. The first issue, and again this is where the sights comes in, was the linkages to the primary sight, which was a little bit wobbly. So the primary sight was the one that goes up through the roof, it's the periscope. There were field kits issued to remedy the problem, but the real solution was a direct vision telescopic sight through the mantlet next to the gun. Also, there was no hatch for the loader, and somehow it took them 9 months to figure out how to drill a hole in the turret roof for him. And if there is something that you look at a Sherman from 1942 and it stops it from being hands down the absolute best tank in the world, nothing even comes close, I'd say it's the lack of a turret hatch for the loader. They also added, as you can see in this photo, a little bit of applique armor around where the turret cheek was ground out to make room for the gun control equipment inside. So anyway, they made improvements. At this point, it's worth addressing a common complaint about German tanks, that they kept changing things on the production line. Again, Americans did the same thing, but the difference isn't that a tank of March 44 was different to one of April 44. The difference was that because of the methods of production, these changes didn't normally slow down the lines or have issues with repair parts. So, moving on to guns. The 57mm was not invented here. You will often hear that the Americans refused to use piece of equipment X simply because it wasn't invented in the US, and this is obviously untrue. Look at the P-51 Mustang's engine, for example. The 6-pounder was the same. The American Army looked at the 6-pounder and said, it's a better anti-tank gun than we have, let's make it. And they made the 57mm M1, which is the standard US anti-tank gun of the war. So the question was, can we put this into a tank, like the M7? Or a tank destroyer, like the T-48 or T-49. The 6-pounder, aka 57, had a high velocity, provided a flatter trajectory than the 75, making it more accurate. It was harder hitting, had a higher rate of fire, it was lighter, all these good things. But Tank Destroyer Branch said, hang on a second, at over 500 meters, that light little projectile from the 57mm will lose its penetration faster, to the point that the 75 is actually still better at range, and we expect typical combat to be at ranges of over 500 yards. Armored Force was saying, hang on a second, if we're shooting a 6-pounder high explosive round, it's less effective against infantry and other soft targets, that, the majority of things that we expect we shoot at, than the 75mm is. So the 57mm never entered US service. Not because it was foreign, but because it just didn't work for the US. I should say the 57 on the vehicle. The only TDs built with the 57 were the T-48s, lend-leased for Britain to the USSR. Again, the 6-pounder, great gun, standard anti-tank gun. Remember, in the US Army, an anti-tank gun and a tank destroyer gun are not the same thing. So the replacement for the 75 was a 3-inch gun, such as mounted on the M10, an interim vehicle. General Bruce didn't want this. He wanted something at least as hard-hitting as a tank, but much, much faster. The M10, being a Sherman derivative, was about Sherman speed. However, there was a war right now, and the T-49/T-67/T-70 was still in development. So M10 it was. But as an interim vehicle, it had to be cheap. So, for example, there's no turret motor in the vehicle. But again, it's using proven M4 equipment to mitigate the reliability risks of another vehicle type. The problem with the 3-inch was you couldn't put it into a Sherman. They tried. The initial requirement back in 1941 was to put a 3-inch gun into the Sherman, as well as a 105mm and a 75mm. The idea was modular turret design. You just bolt a different mount and mountlet on the front and you kind of rejigger the interior for ammo. That was the thinking. However, the 3-inch was too heavy, the whole thing didn't work, and they had to wait until something else came along. That something else was a 76mm. What had happened was new alloys were developed. So you could either make the same type of gun for half the weight, or you could make a bigger gun for the same weight. So if you look at the 3-inch as a basis of comparison, the 76mm was half the weight, and the 90mm was the same weight, which is why you start to have this divergence in guns as well. Devers, the head of Armoured Force, was notified of the existence of the 76mm by way of a telephone call early August 1942, and a stenographer was listening in. The transcript is in the archives, and I have a link to it below. He had a couple of questions. His first question was, "How long is it?" Then he had another question, and I'm going to quote, "The only thing that worries me a little bit now is that this isn't going to throw us off our present setup so we can get to fighting. I'm anxious to get M4 tanks with anything in them so we can go to fighting." Again, perfect is the enemy of good enough. There is also something to be said for Arthur C. Clarke's story Superiority, if you're into SF. "We've got a water fight. We can't wait for this new development to come out before we go. Hey, guess what happens to the Germans at Kursk? They wait, say, hey, we finally got our new Panther. And then we let the Soviets prepare and we got our asses kicked. And the tanks broke down anyway." So once Devers had that question out of the way, he had other questions like, how many rounds can it carry? How heavy are the rounds? And so on. Ammunition capacity is a repeating theme in the archives. It was a stated policy that if you needed more punch for dealing with something, the first choice of action was to increase velocity. And only if that wasn't good enough would you then move to a larger caliber, because with a larger caliber you fired fewer rounds in the tank, or you carried fewer rounds, you had a slower rate of fire, the chances were that the round might be a little bit less accurate because it was probably slower. Ammunition capacity was a huge thing, and you will see it come up time and time again in the archives. However, in the summer of 1942, apparently before they called Devers, Ordnance Branch managed to stuff the 76mm into an M4 turret. Huzzah! They sent it to Aberdeen Proving Ground, and it passed all the tests. The gun fit, it didn't break the tank when it fired, it generally hit what it was aiming at. Fantastic! And there was a rush because they wanted 1,000 of these things to partake in the invasion of North Africa. Now, it's worth remembering that at this point, in the summer of 42, the biggest, nastiest thing that the Germans had was a Panzer IV, which the 75mm Sherman was proving quite capable of dealing with. So this is a case of the army wanting bigger guns on its tanks, just in case the opposition came up with something bigger themselves, which also puts a massive hole in the old trope that US tanks weren't supposed to fight other tanks. Long other discussion. But anyway, the only reason to put a higher velocity gun into the M4 at this point was tank fighting. Now, unfortunately, Armoured Force finally got a hold of one of these 76 tanks, and they tested it themselves as the end user. And they concluded along the lines of, we don't care what you engineers say. Yeah, it may technically work, but you won't have to fight in the damn thing. It was incredibly cramped inside. The crews could not make the most of the tank. There were issues using the sights. In the end, Armoured Force rejected it and said, try again, give us a proper working tank. And off Ordnance Branch went. Now, I'm going to abruptly detour here and ask you another question, in the hope that you haven't seen my other talk yet. What do all these vehicles have in common? Again, I pause to let you ponder. The answer is that these are all vehicles that were approved for production, and in the case of the M7, they built a factory just to build the things. I have a video on that, the Quad Cities Tank Arsenal, linked below. And then, once they were approved, it was realized we don't need these we don't want them, whatever. So the M5 was a heap of rubbish, the M476 just didn't work, I just mentioned it, the T23 I'll come back to in a bit, and the M7 they couldn't see a point to it over the M4, And so they cut production in that new tank plant to 6 prototypes and 7 production models all told. Actually, some of the prototypes were not even built there, built at Rock Island across the river. This was not exactly great stewardship of the taxpayers' money. So to try to reduce this sort of thing, they invented the Special Armored Vehicles Board, which is also known as the Palmer Board. This met in late 1942, and its purpose was to look at all the various different designs which were being made to meet different requirements, like an armored car, a tank destroyer, a light tank, and so on. They started with 19 vehicles and cut it down to maybe 4. They were fairly ruthless about it. Even if a design was showing promise, if it wasn't showing as much promise as another design to do the same job, the project was terminated in order to preserve man-hours, dollars, steel, and probably sanity. In the meantime, the US are still trying to help out the British. This is Assault Tank T-14, which uses some of the developments of the M6. It looks vaguely Sherman-esque. The US Army didn't want the thing for the same reason they didn't want the M6. But the British wanted an assault tank and said, hey, we're going to go build Excelsior. You Americans, can you build one to fit the job and we'll compare notes? So the Americans built a couple. One for the UK, where it still lives today in Bovington, and one for the US for domestic testing. Basically, we built the thing and see if it works anyway. The answer was no. There were fumes in the fighting compartment, cramped positions, the hull machine gun had a reputation for breaking the hull gunner's arm, there were suspension problems, inaccessible components, that the thing was not fightable, which is why T-14 never went anywhere. But the Americans are still interested in British development. So the photo is of a British Crusader in testing in Fort Knox. The chap up top is an American. The vehicles were tested not so much to see what they should build locally, but to see what design features the British had come up with which merited copying. Now the British tanks were something of a disaster. A British chap named Alex Richardson was present for the demonstration of Centaur and Cromwell in the US, sort of the proposed British Sherman equivalents, and they did not do well. To quote his letter back to the UK, "These tanks have made us a laughingstock out here. Cromwell has had a variety of troubles, and it was mad only sending out one of each. The Americans are politely indifferent as to what happens to them, and Waller, the Rolls-Royce man, is most unhappy and wants them withdrawn as soon as possible. We are undoubtedly the world's worst salesmen." Now the image below is from Exercise Dracula, a month-long 2,000-mile test. So they drove these tanks all over England in the late summer of '43, both on and off road. Now to give you an idea of how far 2,000 miles is, to get from Southampton at the bottom of England all the way to John O'Groats at the top of Scotland, according to Google Maps, is 700 miles. So in effect, they went the equivalent all the way from the bottom of the country to the top of the country, all the way back down again, and then back up again to the top. Note how the amount of specialist man-hours is half to maintain the Sherman versus to maintain the British tanks. Now, don't get me wrong, the British tanks at the time were still in fairly early development, and Cromwell would have most of its issues remedied by the time it hits combat in 1944. Centaur would be given up as bad lot. The point here is to show that Sherman in 1943 was combat capable and very reliable. Ordnance tested things, well, not exactly to destruction, but they tested them a lot. I ran into a report in the Tank Destroyer Archives which stated that over a 2,000-mile course, the average speed of an M10A1 is 1 mile an hour less than that of an M10. Doubtless vital, important information, but they tested it. Did German vehicles undertake a 2,000-mile endurance test before they entered production? Given what happened to Panther, I'm going to guess no. I found a report from the M18 stating that a lock washer on the transmission seemed likely to fail by 4,000 miles, so it needed to be redesigned or reworked or whatever before the vehicle was put into production. Now, it doesn't seem to me that a lock washer is that hard to repair or replace if it goes, or even just make it process to replace it during routine 2,000-mile servicing, whatever. But because it might fail before 4,000 miles, redesign it, and that way nobody needs to worry about it. So I'm going to go, again, a couple of quotes on Sherman from the British testers at Dracula. from Major General Richardson, who oversaw the test. The performance of the Shermans throughout the exercise has been outstanding as regards reliability and durability, and the enthusiasm shown by their crews is proof of their confidence in this type of machine. This is not only in respect of their mechanical reliability, but also in respect of their fightability, as was clearly proven at Lulworth when their main armament was tested. A Major Ronald of Westminster Dragoons wrote as follows: "The outstanding lesson of this exercise has been the exceptional reliability of the American machines. All my ideas, based on 2.5 years' experience with an armoured regiment equipped with British machines, have had to be revised. And though, before the exercise started, I was inclined to think that perhaps Sherman was somewhat overrated, I am completely convinced of the superiority of this machine over anything that this country has produced to date." And here's sort of the clincher line from him. "It is evident that the commander of a unit equipped with Shermans can be confident of taking 99% of his vehicles into battle, at any rate during the first 2,000 miles of their life." Now that sort of reliability is A, critical for commanders, and B, non-existent for most other armies of the time. It's not just about how many tanks show up, but it's also about how rested the crews and mechanics are. So if they can show up without having had to spend extra time and effort repairing things, they're probably better rested. A battalion was a battalion when it got to where it was going. It wasn't most of a battalion or some of a battalion with stragglers waiting to catch up, and it wasn't a battalion which needed to be stood down for major maintenance after a long road march. This provided numbers which commanders could rely upon when allocating forces. The final word on Dracula I would give to Major Clifford, officer commanding the exercise. There is little that I can say. This type of tank seems to be almost without reproach, and personally I would be delighted to take a Sherman squadron to war. This is a tank produced in 1942 as tested in mid-1943, and should be as such rated in comparison with other commonly found tanks in the front line at the time. Now I'll talk about the 1944-45 bit in a minute. Regardless of era, however, US tanks were tested anywhere from the deserts of Indio, California to the freezing temperatures of Fort Greely, Alaska. And the takeaway is they worked. Can't be overemphasized enough. They went to ridiculous levels of detail in testing. So there was box after box in the archives on the effects of mold on rubber in the Pacific Theater. Individual components would receive testing, such as a fuel pump from Company A versus one from Company B. Random QA would be conducted, so you will find test reports like report of test of Chrysler tank M4 serial number 14526, randomly taken off the line and tried out to make sure that the standards of quality were being maintained throughout production. So on to sustainment. You know the old saw, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. So here's one of those other vehicles which some say won the war, the CCKW, or the Deuce and a Half. Now it's called a 2.5 ton truck, but that was the off-road rating. On road, it was rated for up to 5 tons. And the Red Ball Express, of course, was all on the road. The truck will carry 250 5-gallon cans, or in total 1,250 gallons of fuel. A 1-ton trailer carries an additional 40 cans, bringing the total to 1,450 gallons of fuel per truck and driver. And of course, the Americans tested it all. This chart is fuel and oil requirements per 100 miles for a company of 17 medium tanks. Each barrel represents 100 gallons. So in other words, that one CCKW truck can move a 17-tank M4A1 company 100 miles. One single truckload of fuel. And Red Ball had 5,500 trucks rolling at once. So that gives you an idea, A, of just how much fuel a tank sucks down, and B, how efficient an M4 was for all that fuel, which itself also had to be shipped. Again, it's got to go from the refineries to England, and then along the pipeline under the ocean, or more likely because of Pluto tended not to work very well, surface transportation to get to France, and then you put it into 5-gallon cans, and then it'll be trucked over. Every piece of that chain requires fuel, manpower, trucks, manpower to maintain the trucks, ships to carry the spare parts to maintain the trucks. It requires ships to carry the spare parts for the trucks, to carry the food for the mechanics who maintain the fuel trucks, and so on. You see where I'm going. It's kind of like the butterfly effect. A single additional requirement for parts or fuel on the pointy end has all sorts of ramifications all the way back down the line to the US, deciding if a man needs to be drafted, and if so, what he's going to be drafted as, or if he's better off staying in civilian industry. Right, maintenance. The German military suffered a significant problem. They could either make new tanks, or they could make spare parts for tanks. So when Tiger 1 entered production, for every 10 Tiger 1s which came off the production line, they also made a single spare engine and a single spare transmission. The Germans had a massive parts shortage at the end of the line, to the extent that the Germans would have to place armed guards on supply trains to protect, not against saboteurs, but against units which were staging raids to get spare parts for their own vehicles. A mechanic might be dispatched to a railway station ahead of an expected arrival in order to stake their claim on a part, and if they're waiting at a railway station, they're not repairing tanks. Americans did not have this problem. The US brought spare parts, they brought lots of them, and they all fit. Tanks were rarely down for too long. So here's a comparison of transmission changes. The M4 on the left, as I mentioned, you break the tracks, undo the bolts on the front, pull off the front, swap it out, bolt it all back in again, you're done. The Panther, in this case, but it got worse if it was a Tiger or a Panzer III, you had to take off the roof of the hull, then pull out the driver's position, the radio man's position, the radios, which are kind of in the middle above the drive shaft, and disconnect the final drives by presumably lying on your belly and reaching forward. All these things have to come out or be done before you can then pull the transmission backwards and out up through the whole roof. Your 3 mechanics are probably going to replace 1 German transmission in the amount of time it would take them to replace 2 or 3 American ones. And German transmissions tended to have shorter service lives than American ones as well. Now granted, there is a compromise at play here. The big, heavy, welded, armoured front of Panther is really tough to get through. But in the larger scheme of things, it's really worth the additional hassle. Your tank may be the best in the world in combat, but if it is down for maintenance, it is not contributing to the battle. And if it is not contributing to the battle, why do you have a tank? Okay, I mentioned I would come back to T-23. This is where ordnance really sours the army on Pershing. 1943 is when the first tank of the T-23 series shows up. The general idea is you take a tank with a 76mm gun, a lower overall silhouette than the M4, you will have a better tank. The M4, of course, is now in series production, so the immediate requirements were met. The question was, can we improve? The T-20 had issues with the transmission. The T-22 had problems of its own. The T-23 had an electric drive, which in theory was wonderful. It would spin on a dime, it would go backwards as fast as forwards. You could, in theory, drive and fight with 1 man with a remote driver's control in the turret. What's not to like? After a demonstration in April 1943 to Generals McNair, Devers, Somerville and Marshall, it was agreed to build 250 of these tanks as an initial production run. Ordnance promised that all the issues they had identified would be fixed. In hindsight, a number of these tanks would be upgunned, but I'll come back to that also. So when the T-23 is built, Armored Board gets them for testing, and again a number of problems were found. Some were small things like the sight was too high, even our tallest gunner cannot see through it when he's seated. Most of them would be easy fixes, some would not. And I'll come back to this also too. So the M4E6, in the meantime, was a series of modifications to simplify production, increase ergonomics, and increase firepower and survivability. So again, they are trying to decide what can best sustain the war in 1944, and they have a choice. They can either try to refine and improve the M4, which they knew would be available in numbers and which worked, or they could take a gamble on a new tank. Go with what would potentially be a substantially better tank in the T-23, which still had some bugs to work out, or maybe it won't work, or maybe it won't be available in the required numbers. And they're gambling here with the future of the entire Western world. You can perhaps understand that they might be a little bit cautious. As part of the overall progression on M4, you now have the 76mm gun in the T-23 turret. You have a steeper front slope, which simplifies production and also allows for bigger hatches to be easier to get in and out. There's more room inside, although in order to compensate, they needed to make the front a little bit thicker. Wet stowage was introduced to change the burn rate of the tank from average to this thing almost never burns. A better vision cupola for the commander, and so on. And this was all done very quickly. The idea of putting the T-23 turret onto the tank was in March of 43. The finished E6 was in Aberdeen being tested by June. Their testing was completed and the design was approved by September. September 43 was decided that all factories would stop producing 75mm tanks by January of 1944, with a few exceptions such as Lend-Lease, Marine Corps tanks, or some contracts which had already been placed. But the problem was that all these tanks start being produced in January of 44, but you still have to get them all the way overseas, competing with everything else going overseas which required shipping space, such as trucks, ammunition, parts, personnel, food, whatever. And they also seemed to be being categorized as a nice to have, not as an essential. Remember that luxury versus essential thing? Yes, the ETO commander had requested the tanks, but the 75mm army at the time was killing everything it came across, to include Tigers, Panthers, and Ferdinands in Italy. There was, however, a fine detail, which was that although generally speaking, yeah, the 75mm army was working in Italy, the guys fighting in Italy wanted 75mm guns replaced by 76mm tanks as soon as possible. Yes, they were getting the 75 to work, but it would have been preferred to just go with easy mode and a high velocity cannon. That information, however, seems not to have made its way to Europe. So the Americans who are about to invade France go, oh, we've got a couple hundred of these new 76mm gun tanks sitting in storage in UK, which, if we are going to use them, means that a new line of supply is necessary for the ammunition. We have to retrain our tankers, who are already good shots with the 75. We have to retrain our loaders, our mechanics for the new guns. Why bother with all the hassle? It's not worth it. So they left the 76mm gun tanks in the UK. In hindsight, this is what is known in technical terms as an oops. However, it did make some sense at the time. There was another minor relevant issue, and that was the tungsten shortage. Since there was no particular indication that the 76mm tank couldn't do the jobs that the 75 couldn't, they didn't spend any of the tungsten allocation building HVAP ammunition, the high-velocity armor-piercing ammo. They had other things to do with tungsten, such as making machine tools for the factories. In hindsight, this could perhaps be a bad decision. They should have developed HVAP ammo sooner, even if it's just in case. And if there's any one single flaw or mistake I could point to in US tank production in World War II, I would say you should have developed HVAP earlier. The other development was the E8. So to go back a little bit with your next audience consideration question, what was the advantage to building a tank with narrow tracks, and why did the US deliberately build tanks with narrow tracks? Because they did. The M2 and the M3, it was a topic of discussion because everybody knows if you have wide tracks, you get better off-road performance. The answer is weight. The difference in weight between the 16-inch track and the 23-inch track is a full ton per track. That's an additional ton that the drive wheel has to haul around to get the tank up to the same speed. And that's before you get to the extra tonnage of shipping and bridging weights. So it made a lot of sense at the time to go with the narrower track. Again, in hindsight, probably not the best decision. But again, the radial in the Sherman at the time was putting out 350 horsepower versus the 500 horsepower of the Ford V8s later on in the war. In any case, the solution was the Easy 8 suspension, wider track with the horizontal volute suspension. which was already tried out on the M6. So again, not a new idea. The US actually tried all sorts of suspension on M4s, from artillery tractors to half tracks to torsion bar, but they went with the HVSS. The result, if you put everything together, was the M4A3, because that was the preferred engine, 76, with horizontal volute suspension system, which is commonly and incorrectly shortened to the EZ8 Sherman. The definitive Sherman would go on to win the war, see service in Korea, and the Israelis, of course, famously kept them around upgraded. The last of the gun Shermans were withdrawn by Paraguay only in 2018. Now, there is the question of protection. A lot of crewmen would add on armor onto their vehicle in the hopes of greater survivability. To quote Army Ground Forces, "Another point to consider is that any slight addition of armor to existing thickness only adds weight but creates a false sense of security without actually providing any material additional protection. The penetrative power of large caliber tank and anti-tank weapons is such that existing armor would need almost to be doubled in order to provide real protection at medium ranges. Additional protection afforded at longer ranges by slight increases of armor would hardly justify the additional weight and consequently increased load on engines and suspension." So, you're a tank crewman, and you figure out that these 8.8s and long 7.5s are punching through Shermans. And you think, I must do something to make my Sherman tougher. And so you put sandbags or concrete or trackings or whatever it is on. Is a sandbag really going to stop an 88? Probably not. Is your transmission going to be happy with the extra 2 tons of sandbag or whatever that you just put on your tank? Also, probably not. Both the German and American engineers looked into it and said, nope, the way it comes from the factory is the way it is supposed to be. It's almost as if the scientific method has some merit over perceived experience. However, the engineers, right though they may have been scientifically, were not the folks actually going out to get shot at. So I guess I can understand at least the morale advantages of putting all the extra stuff on. Really only Patton on the American side enforced the no field expedient armor thing. Something heavier was needed though, the assault tank, the M4A3E2. I have a whole other video about the E2, link below. But the short version is that yes, it sort of worked, but even with the changed gearings and strengthened suspension, it was only authorized for limited use, not to be used as a general medium tank. So back to the T-23, the greatest tank since sliced bread according to Ordnance, and one which Ordnance was pushing very hard to get sent to combat zones for field testing. This now splits into the T-23 with a 76mm gun and the 90mm tanks T-25 and T-26. The T-23s were given to the 785th Tank Battalion. The result? 300 man-hours of maintenance for every 100 hours of operation. Completely unacceptable. Battalion came up with a list of 26 must-fixes. If Ordnance fixed them, Armoured Force would say, fantastic, we shall declare them battle-worthy and send them overseas. Ordnance came back and said, actually we can't fix all 26, but we can fix most of them, and then you can send those overseas. Army Ground Forces were not enthusiastic. They said, however, okay, we don't like it, but we'll let the commanders in Europe know that we have 150 of these 76mm low-profile tanks, and they can use them if they want. By the way, we are attaching a copy of the test reports. None of the field commanders took them up on it. Initially, the responses were positive, but then they dug into the test reports and reversed position. So T-25 and T-26, I have also covered amply in the past on other videos on this channel. Bottom line, nobody really wanted the 90mm tank initially, not least due to the size of the ammunition. But Ordnance and Barnes were so determined that this was the tank which would win the war that he designed the tank from the start to be able to mount a 17-pounder. The theory was that if the British liked the tank, the British could order the Pershing. And once Pershing was in full-scale production, then his genius design would be taken up by the US Army because the factories were already geared up to make the things. Well, the British in fact ended up going with a different 17-pounder tank instead, Centurion, which was arguably the better decision. Army Ground Forces tested T-26. They made it the E1 because they decided to get rid of the electrical transmission from T-23, which is a disaster. And they said, it doesn't work, it keeps breaking down, we don't want it. Barnes kept pushing for the thing to be field tested anyway. AGF kept pushing back, saying a combat zone is not a testing agency. And though the 20 T-26 E3s were eventually received with great acclaim in Europe in early 1945, they were found, after a few months of use, to be barely acceptable. Good gun, but ye gods the powertrain. There was a reason why Shermans were still commonly used in Korea, even as the M26s themselves were being replaced by M46s. Another topic change. TD lessons. Towed TDs are better than self-propelled TDs, according to experience from North Africa. Well, that may have been the lesson learned, but in practice it was the wrong lesson, because in North Africa there was a bit more defending going on. The terrain was much more open, the guns were much smaller, and so on. Regardless, they started converting TD battalions to towed guns, took them to Italy, realized it was a really, really bad idea, and started to convert them back again the other way by the time they landed in Northwest Europe. There was an attempt to put the 90mm gun onto a tank destroyer. The T-53 was the first crack at it, but it was a bit of a bodge and not wanted. The 90mm M10 derivative, what would become M36 Jackson, was not wanted because it was not fast enough for a tank destroyer like the M18 was. And nobody saw a need for the 90mm at the time anyway. The 76mm was going to be good enough. The engineers also didn't like it because it was too heavy for a number of bridges the M10 could cross. There was a change of heart though. The vehicle was developed for the sake of having it ready if it was deemed required. And by July 1944, it was type classified. This is what they really wanted. The crews may not have wanted it, but Bruce really wanted it. The crews looked at it and said, my God, it has no armor. I can use a pickaxe and punch through this. But in the end, it did get a reputation for killing tanks, with basically the same 76mm gun as would be mounted on the Sherman. It's not often observed, but the tanks and tank destroyers of the same generation generally had the same gun. 75mm for the M4 and the M3 half-track, 76mm for the M4E6 and the M18, 90mm for the M26 and M36. The TDs would show up first though, as the mechanical problems of putting a gun into a thinly armoured, open-topped vehicle are far simpler than those for doing so in a tank. If used well, a Sherman was about as capable mechanically of killing tanks as an M18. So what was the M4 good at? Well, firstly, it was there. It was reliable. You knew it would do what it was supposed to. Now, here's an example of design. The gunner in all three of these tanks, Sherman, Panzer IV, and Panther, can see the camera. Which one is better at ambushing the enemy? It's a simple design. I have no idea why the Germans did not put a roof-mounted sight in their tanks. But the first tank to fire in an engagement wins 4 times out of 5. Who is going to spring the ambush better? Then there is the matter of ergonomics. The top photo is a still from my Panther inside the hatch video. To get the round out, I'm crouched down, rotating the round after grabbing it from hull stowage. There's no turret ready rack in a Panther. On the M4, I'm seated on a chair quite comfortably, easy and quick. Crew survival. You've heard Sherman is a death trap, and again, I go over this in greater detail elsewhere, but these are the official figures. In the entire war, Armored Force lost that many tankers killed. Now, there are glaring asterisks to this number. It doesn't count all those tankers who were branched infantry before Armored Force was created. It doesn't count officers, as there were no Armored Force officers. It doesn't count emergency replacements like clerks and whatnot. I've seen a couple of other analyses, and done one myself, to the extent that the actual figure of US tankers killed was really somewhere shy of 3,000. Then again, there are also analyses which indicate that the figure is then halved if you discount tanker-branched crewmen who were killed outside of their tanks. Plus, Stuart survivability rates were a little bit worse than Sherman's, and they kind of go in there as well. Anyway, no matter which way you cut it, you're better off getting drafted into tanks than into infantry. And that was on the winning side. I wouldn't care to guess the crew survivability rates of German tankers. Part of the reason for the survivability is how easy it is to get out of a Sherman if you have to. The small hatch M4 with the hatch right above you just pop the hatch out, you get. I went from dogged hatch to on the ground in about 8 seconds. If you look at other tanks, not quite so convenient. Something else to consider is how much larger those infantry casualties could have been without all the Shermans. Even if you accept the whole, quote, the only reason Shermans were good was because there were a lot of them, unquote, argument, which I vehemently do not, that also means that when there are a lot of tanks around and you're an infantryman faced with an MG42 position to eliminate, well, there's an advantage to having so many M4s in theatre in that there's a good chance one might be around when you need it. Shooting a tank round is far more effective at saving lives than attempting to get a grenade into a bunker without getting shot. Superior German infantry or machine guns be damned, they will still die to 75mm fragmentation. I doubt German infantry found heavy armor support to be quite as common. The M4 was also very versatile. You could convert the tank to do anything. Swimming, flamethrowing, artillery, bridging, the list is massive. Rejected things. The 17-pounder conversion. Again, plenty of other videos on this. But the Americans tested it, they didn't think it was a good idea. I don't think it was a good idea for the Americans, at least. I'm not going to say that the British were wrong in pursuing it, although I think they could have done better with using more M10 conversions instead. But it made no sense from the American perspective at all. If nothing else, go back to the attempt that the Americans made to put a 76mm into the small Sherman turret. If they had rejected that, you can imagine their position on the same turret with an even bigger gun twice the weight in it. Again, I have other videos where I rant on this topic. Yes, I am ignoring the 100 or so manufactured for the US Army at the very end of the war, but there seems to be no documentation as to what the rationale was behind it, unless it was political. Infrared. Oh, the Germans had infrared on Panthers. They were awesome and technologically advanced. Well, the Americans had infrared. The Soviets had infrared. They just realized that it didn't work. And guess what? When the Germans tried, they also realized that it didn't work. The difference was that the Germans realized it didn't work after spending the time and effort and putting it into the field on battalion level scales to issue in the desperate hope that it might actually work and have an effect on their losses. Then, after they realized it